Hello and welcome to the first video on Chapter 5, the Integumentary system. Hopefully I'm coming through a lot clearer than in the previous videos. I decided to step my game up and use my son's gaming headphones where the microphone works much better. So if I'm really loud right now, it's probably because I've switched microphones. But hopefully this will allow you to hear me a little clearer. I know sometimes I talk really fast, but keep in mind a couple things. This is our first organ system chapter. So you're going to be applying a lot of the things you've learned in the previous chapters. You're going to be seeing some of that terminology from chapter 1. You're going to have a little bit of cell biology in here. You're going to have a little bit of tissue. So we're definitely building off of prior knowledge. And that was kind of the whole point of chapter 1 through 4, is to build some foundation. But this is our first system, so we're starting to put some things together. It's not an overly difficult system. I think many of you already kind of know a little bit about your skin and have heard some of the terminology, such as epidermis and dermis, and you know that you have sweat glands and oil glands, but it's all about getting down to those minor details. So this chapter is going to be covered in 3 videos. Collectively, this should take about an hour to get through those 3 videos, but hopefully you'll have your study guide / guided notes in front of you right now and your chapter 5 labeling lab in front of you right now, because you can knock those out at the very same time you're watching these lectures. And if you don't have those two, at least take notes. If you haven't been taking notes during lecture, I highly recommend you get into that habit, because now is when you're going to be developing those study habits, and hopefully they're successful and you can apply those to basically every chapter the rest of the way. Okay, so let's begin with our chapter topics. We start with major functions. Many of these functions you've probably already know, but we'll kind of go through the major functions of our integumentary system. Then we're basically going to break it down. We're going to break it down into the epidermis versus the dermis, and then the hypodermis. Now, technically, the hypodermis is not considered part of your skin. It's what your dermis is attached to. But we typically talk a little bit about it. Just, that it's largely made up of adipose tissue and areolar connective tissue. But we're going to be spending a lot of time in the epidermis. That's the superficial layer of your skin. And then it has kind of sublayers to it. Then we get to the deeper layer, which is the dermis, and it has 2 regions that we're going to look at. So we're going to start off with the epidermis, talk about the 5 layers. These layers are called strata. A stratum is a layer. And most areas of your body have 4 layers. The additional 5th layer is only found in thick skin. Thick skin is what you would call the skin of your palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Everywhere else we call it thin skin. We're going to get into some cell types. So what cells are found in the epidermis? Some examples are going to be the keratinocytes, which make up most of the epidermis, the melanocytes that produce melanin or the pigmentation. There's an immune cell called a Langerhans cell, and then there's a Merkel cell, which is part of your sensory structures of the skin. Then we move down into the dermis. And like I mentioned, it's kind of divided into 2 regions. Most of that dermis is connective tissues, areolar connective tissue, and irregular connective tissue. This is where we're also going to start looking at things like hair and hair follicles, glands, the different types of sweat glands and the oil gland. We'll get into some sensory structures that are largely found in the dermis as well. So sensory receptors of the skin include, touch receptors, temperature or thermoreceptors. You've got pain sensors. You've got all kinds of different receptors in your skin because, again, that skin is very important in detecting things in your environment. Hair and nails are accessory structures. We'll talk about those. I'm bald, so I don't really like to talk about hair that often, but since this is my job, I guess we'll have to talk about hair a little bit. Glands of the skin, again, you've got a couple types of sweat glands, known as sudoriferous glands. You've got sebaceous glands that produce oil, and then you have ceruminous glands, which produce wax in your external auditory canal. And then finally, we wrap it up with skin cancers. A very important topic is skin cancer, and then finally burns. So let's begin with the 5 major functions of your skin. The obvious number 1 function is to protect you from your environment. There's a lot of things in the environment that can harm you, such as UV light, which can obviously increase your risk of skin cancer. Microorganisms in the environment. Very few of them can penetrate through intact skin. So intact skin is one of our most important barriers against infectious organisms. And then it also prevents water loss, but also water gain. We don't want to lose water through our skin and become severely dehydrated. We also don't want to gain water. So if you go swimming in a swimming pool or even just go out in high humidity, you wouldn't want all that moisture to enter the body. So your skin acts as a nice barrier between both water loss and water gain. Number 2, sensation. So again, a lot of different sensory receptors. So this is your nervous system component. It's going to detect temperature changes, different types of touch sensors in your skin, pressure, there's pain receptors, and even more. Number 3, temperature regulation. We want to be able to regulate that normal body temperature, that 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. We do that largely by blood flow. So your blood is hot. Your blood carries heat. So if we need to remove heat, we can move more blood to the skin and then remove that heat. If we need to kind of contain the heat because we're cold and we don't want to lose heat, we can then kind of shift that blood flow away from the skin so we don't lose that heat. And then obviously there's sweat, which is going to help remove heat from the body. And then don't forget our muscles can actually generate more heat if we cause them to shiver. Number 4, vitamin D production. Vitamin D, one of the most important things for vitamin D is to absorb calcium. So you get calcium from your diet, but you have to absorb it into your body. And vitamin D helps in that process. You can get vitamin D from your diet. You can also make your own kind of natural form. And that requires sunlight. So you have to be exposed to UV light. You also obviously need skin to kind of capture that light. And then there's a whole complicated mechanism or pathway involving other organs like your kidneys in order to produce vitamin D. And then your skin does do a little excretion. So in that sweat, there are some waste products. Most of these waste products are eliminated in urine, but you also find some of them in sweat. So those are your basic functions. This is a drawing. Every book has a very similar drawing showing the different layers of the skin as well as the structures in the skin. So this would be that kind of first image to start working on. There's an ID game in the module that you can kind of practice some of your labeling, but I definitely suggest that you work on these structures. Let's start with the different layers. So like I mentioned, 3 major layers, starting with the most superficial layer being your epidermis. And we heard the epidermis in the past as being a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. So that's this layer up here. You can see that a lot of these cells are flattening up towards the surface. And when we get closer to that epidermis, we're going to see there's actually either 4 to 5 different strata or layers in the epidermis. Moving deep, we get into the dermis. And this dermis, as I mentioned before, is made up of 2 layers. This little portion here is kind of wrong. That line should go all the way down to here. So both your epidermis and dermis all the way to here make up your skin. And then you have the subcutaneous or hypodermis that technically isn't considered part of your skin. So we'll get into the dermis in the second video, where we get into more of this connective tissue found in here and these other structures. So you'll notice you've got hair surrounded by a hair follicle. You've got a little muscle here attached to that hair follicle called the erector pili muscle, which causes your hair to stand up. You've got a lot of blood vessels in the dermis where you don't have blood vessels in the epidermis. And you've got glands. We're going to take a look at some of these glands moving forward. So the 3 major layers, this is just a micrograph, so this is an actual view of these layers. And you can start to make out that the epidermis has some different appearance here. So again, we'll get into the different layers, but you can see that this outer layer looks quite a bit different than this deeper layer. And then when we get down to the dermis, this should look familiar. Down here, deep in the dermis, is irregular connective tissue, where you start to see all this collagen moving in various directions. So let's begin with the epidermis. We've got a micrograph here on the right, lined up pretty closely to a drawing. So sometimes in anatomy, we like to start with a drawing. Sometimes when we look at the real thing, it's much harder to kind of interpret. So I love when textbooks show both the real image as well as a drawing. When you learn the epidermis, first of all, you got to remind yourself that it is keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelial tissue. There's 5 layers, okay? Most areas of your body only has 4, but in thick skin you have an additional stratum lucidum. So in thin skin, you wouldn't see this thin, kind of clear layer. You would only have the other 4. When you learn the epidermis, you can do it either moving superficial down to deep, as if maybe you were, I don't know, a needle going into the skin, or maybe you stepped on a nail and it's penetrating through your skin. Or you can work on it deep, moving superficial. Now, to me, that's the best way, because you'll notice that the cells actually move through the different layers. So the cells kind of begin their life down here in this deep stratum basal layer. And then as the cells divide by mitosis, they get pushed and they kind of migrate and eventually go through all the layers until they reach the surface, and then they will slough off or they get removed. All right, so that's the direction in which your epidermis grows. And this takes anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks before a cell down here in the deep layer eventually migrates all the way to the surface. So to me, that makes the most sense. So that's how I'm going to go over the 5 layers. And the next slide gives a little more information on these 5 layers. What you'll want to focus on is the order. So, in every class you're asked about, the order. So, choose the correct order of these layers, either deep to superficial, or again, maybe the question's asking about something penetrating through the layers and you have to know them superficial to deep. So, deepest layer attached to the basement membrane. I remind you that this little layer here that separates the epidermis from the dermis is known as the basement membrane. It's basically, I think of it as kind of a layer of glue. It's what attaches that epidermis to the dermis. So this first layer attached to the basement membrane is known as the stratum basal. It's a single layer of cells. And these cells are mostly what we would refer to as stem cells. They don't really have a function yet. Now, most of them are going to become keratinocytes and produce keratin, but they haven't started doing that yet. So they're kind of considered a stem cell. Now, they're not like an embryonic stem cell where it could potentially become almost any cell in the body. They pretty much can only, become these keratinocytes. We'll also see that you might have a melanocyte in there, but this drawing doesn't show the melanocytes. So stratum basale, notice that they are going to be the closest layer to the dermis. So the dermis is down here, and the dermis is where you're going to have blood vessels. Recall that the epidermis is epithelial tissue, which is avascular. So these cells will be close to the bloodstream. So they're going to be able to get nutrients, they're going to be able to get oxygen, and they're going to be very happy. So they're going to be undergoing mitosis very, very well. As they get pushed up through the strata, they get further and further from those blood vessels. So as the cells reach basically this stratum granulosum, they'll start to die. So this granulosum layer is what we refer to as the dying layer. So let's move up. We move up to the stratum spinosum. It's called spinosum because the cells kind of have spines. This drawing isn't very good at showing the little spines, but the cells are kind of spiny in appearance. They're still growing. They're still dividing by mitosis. They're starting to fill up with lipids. They're starting to produce keratin. So now they kind of have a job. So they're not considered stem cells anymore. So these would all probably be keratinocytes. As they get pushed up, they become the stratum granulosum. This is called the granulosum because they have these granules, kind of these dark vesicles in them. So usually you can see the granulosum as kind of a darker layer in that epidermis. Then, if you are thick skin, you become the lucidum. If you're in thin skin, you would become the corneum. All right. So lucidum is called the lucidum because the cells are translucent. They're kind of clear looking, and it's not that easy to see that on a real micrograph. So that's where the drawing is useful. So stratum lucidum only in thick skin, palms of your hands, soles of your feet. Cells are dead by now. Okay, so they can't get any oxygen or nutrients, so they die, and only found in thick skin. They get pushed up and become the stratum corneum. That's the most superficial layer. It can vary in thickness. So if this was, soles of your feet, palms of your hands, this would be very thick layer. If it was, say, the skin of your eyelid, which is kind of known as being the thinnest skin, there would only be a few layers of cells. And again, these cells are dead, but they're very, very protective because they're loaded with keratin, and there's a lot of lipids in between them that kind of help act as a barrier. Okay, so that's kind of looking at the layers. Here's the information that you might want to focus in on for these 5 layers. Note the stratum basale, single layer, basal cells or stem cells, most of them becoming keratinocytes, attached to the basement membrane, actively undergoing mitosis. So they're dividing very, very quickly compared to some of the other layers. You might find a Merkel cell, which we'll talk more about those in the future. Those are a type of touch receptor. And then you'll have some melanocytes in that layer that are producing the melanin. Spinosum, a thicker layer, so now you got 8 to 10 layers of cells. Spiny looking. You might find a Langerhans cell, so this is yet another cell type. These are immune system cells. They're phagocytes, so they can actually gobble up a microbe if it's gotten this far. Cells are growing a little slower, but they're still living cells. Granulosum, again, the dying layer, but by this point they're really loading up with keratin and other protective molecules. Lucidum, translucent layer, only in thick skin. completely dead keratinocytes. And then finally, that corneum, most superficial, large amounts of keratin, can be up to 30, even maybe a little more layers, or down to just a few layers. Often we call these corneocytes, but they're going to be really good at protection, and then eventually these cells shed from the surface. Okay, so that's the epidermis. That's the 5 layers of the epidermis. We've already talked about some of these cells, but here we have the major cell types found in the epidermis. The keratinocytes being the most abundant. Notice that keratin is an intracellular protein, so it's found inside of these cells. Whereas when we get to the dermis, the collagen and elastic fibers are actually extracellular proteins. So most of your epidermis are the keratinocytes. You're going to have some melanocytes because you got to produce melanin. Melanin is the pigmentation that helps protect from UV light. And what's interesting, we're going to see on an upcoming slide, is these melanocytes will actually share the melanin with the keratinocytes because you want to be able to protect them as well. While we're talking about melanocytes, there's a couple disorders of melanin production. Albinism versus vitiligo. So albinism is congenital, which means you're kind of born with it. It's a genetic problem in which you have the melanocytes, but they are unable to produce or completely produce the pigmentation, the melanin. So you're going to have, lack or loss of melanin throughout the entire body. So skin, hair, eyes use pigmentation because there's a defect in an enzyme. Okay, so it's kind of everywhere throughout the body. Vitiligo is chronic, meaning it kind of it occurs over a period of time. It's a depigmentation, so there was pigmentation, but then it was lost. Major cause kind of unknown. There are some genetic factors, but vitiligo occurs in kind of patches throughout the skin, and then those patches can get bigger. They believe it's an autoimmune disease where the immune system is actually destroying some of these melanocytes. So now you don't have the melanocytes in those patches of skin. These are just some other cells we mentioned. Merkel cell, so that cell would be in the epidermis. It's kind of attached to a sensory neuron. They're part of your sense of touch. And then this is a Langerhans cell, which is, again, it's an immune cell that can phagocytose. The other name for these cells are intraepidermal macrophages, which basically just means they're inside the epidermis. Okay, this is our little drawing showing the melanin production of a melanocyte. So notice where we are. This is the basement membrane. The melanocytes sit in that first stratum basal. They produce melanin, so they use the ER and the Golgi to produce melanin in these little melanosomes, which are basically little vesicles containing the pigment. Then what will happen is the keratinocytes will actually phagocytose, bring in that melanin in order to protect them. So now you've got all the cells here, the keratinocytes and the melanocytes being protected with melanin. Okay, next video we're going to move on into the dermis. We'll talk about the dermis. We'll also start getting into some of these other structures you'll find in the dermis. And then the third video is when we're going to get into skin cancers and different degrees of burns.